Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Vav Mishnah Daled. The Mishnah says, Yisrael shekiben mikohen u'melevi. If a Yisrael received a field as a sharecropper from a Kohen or a Levi, Hamasrot LaBe'alim, the tithes belong to the landowner, because we assume that the landowner meant to keep all the tithes for himself. Meaning, if the landowner is a Kohen, all the Terumah, the entire land goes to him, and then the rest of the produce is divided between the landowner and the sharecropper, who can give his share of the maaser to the Levi of his choice. And again, if the landowner is a Levi, all the maaser goes to him, and then the remainder of the produce, including the terumah, is divided between the landowner and the sharecropper, who can give his share of the terumah to any kohen of his choice. Now, the Rav tells us, even the Tanakama of the previous Mishnah, who said that a Kohen or a Levi sharecropper does not acquire the right to the tithes from Israel landowner, even he agrees with our Mishnah that the Kohen or Levi landowner keep the rights of the Terumah or Maaser when they rent the field to a Israel sharecropper. The reason being, since the field was the Kohen or the Levi's to begin with, he doesn't have to make a kinyan to acquire the rights to have them. All he has to do is to avoid giving them away. So the lease agreement is understood how? It's understood to mean that the entire field is being leased to the sharecropper, except for the place where the Terumah and Maaser are going to grow. The Terumah and Maaser later is separated. Therefore belongs to the landowner, and then the rest of the crop is divided according to the percentage of their lease agreement. Now, until now, the Mishnah discussed how you divide Terumah, which is given to a Kohen, and Maaser Rishon, which is given to a Levi. The Mishnah now is going to bring a machloket about how you divide Maaser Sheni, which has to be brought to Yerushalayim and eaten there. The Mishnah says, Rabbi Ishmael says, Hakartani shekibel tzadeh miYerushalmi. Kartani, the Rav says, is from a lashon of a villager, which means somebody who lives outside of Yerushalayim. So if a villager who lives outside of Yerushalayim receives a field as a sharecropper from a Yerushalmi, somebody who lives in Yerushalayim, Maaser Sheni shel Yerushalmi. Rabbi Ishmael says that the Maaser Sheni belongs to the Yerushalmi, the one who lives in Yerushalayim. Why? We assume the villager, according to Rabbi Ishmael, we assume the villager gives up his right to the Maaser Sheni to the landowner, because he doesn't want the burden of having to bring it to Yerushalayim and eat it there. Now again, Rabotai, the Mishnah speaks about a villager only because it's common for villagers to work as sharecroppers in fields owned by city dwellers like Yerushalmis. But again, Rabbi Ishmael holds that this villager sharecropper gives up, we assume he gives up his portion of the Maaser Sheni to the Yerushalmi owner, because he doesn't want the burden of having to bring it to Yerushalayim and eat it there. But the sages say, the villager himself is able to go up and eat the Maaser Sheni in Yerushalayim, and their logic is, since he can travel to Yerushalayim at any time, there is no reason to assume that he gives up his share of the Maaser Sheni. Therefore, the Maaser Sheni also is divided between the landowner and the sharecropper. And the Mefarshim explained to us, unlike Terumah and Maaser, which exclusively belong to either the Kohen or the Levi, they said cannot keep it. Maaser Sheni is something that a villager can benefit from by bringing it to Yerushalayim. Therefore, there is no reason to assume that in the lease agreement, the villager gave up his right for the Maaser Sheni to the Yerushalmi. Therefore, again, like we said, the Maaser Sheni is divided between the landowner and the sharecropper, and the sharecropper can take his portion of the Maaser Sheni and eat it in Yerushalayim. And the Rab tells us, V'chen halacha, this is the halacha, like the sages, not like Rabbi Ishmael. That is the Rabotai Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey says, Hamikabel zetim leshemen. If somebody receives olive trees as a sharecropper to produce oil, meaning he receives a tree that are full of olives, his job is to pick the olives, press them into oil, and then divide the oil between him and the owner. Kishem shecholkin b'chulin, kach cholkin b'terumah. So the halacha is, just like they divide the chulin, the tithe portion of the oil between them, they also divide the terumah and maaser portion of oil between them as well. Now, in this case, it makes no difference whether the sharecropper is a Israel leasing from a Kohen or a Levi, or a Kohen or Levi leasing from a Israel. Either way, they share the terumah or maaser, just like they share the rest of the oil. Now, the Mefarshim explained to us that we learned in the previous Mishnah, when a Israel sharecropper leases a field from a Kohen or a Levi, the owner keeps all the Tirumah or Maasel, because again it's built in the agreement, the Kohen or Levi, they do not give up the Tirumah and Maasel portion, and we explained that the reason was he excludes it from the agreement, from the parts of the land where the tithes are going to go, he holds of himself. Here, however, there's a distinction. Why? It's not the use of the land or the trees that are being leased, but the right to harvest the oils and make them into oil. Holding back from the lease part of the land or the trees is not of no use to the owner here. Why? Because the land's not being leased. It's fully grown olives that are being leased in order to work them. So the landowner therefore has no more right to tithes from this oil than the sharecropper, and they divide the tithes the same as they do the oil. Now, the Mefarshim tell us, the Tosfot says, this is certainly true where a Kohen or a Levi sharecropper leases from a Israel landowner, where the Tana Kama of Mishnah Gimel said they divide the tithes even in the case of leasing itself, but the Chidush is even if it's a Kohen or a Levi landowner that is renting it off to a Israel sharecropper. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, Israel shekibel mikohen u'melevi zetim l'shemen. If a Israel accepts olive trees as a sharecropper from a Kohen or a Levi to produce oil from them, lamachatzit sachar, we're going to read it like the Rabbi says, or lamachatzit sachar, or where he partners with a Kohen or a Levi to sell his oil for half the profits. Meaning, Rabotai, we're not saying sharecropper case anymore in Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says either sharecropper case or a case where it's a business agreement, meaning the owner of the trees has a bunch of olives. He enters into an agreement with a merchant, a businessman, to sell the oil that the olives will produce, and each partner is going to receive half the profits from the sale. Rabbi Yehuda says, all the tithes belong to the owner, which is either the Kohen keeps the Terumah, or if he's a Levi, keeps the Maaser. Now, the reason for this, the Mefarshim explain, Rabbi Yehuda considers leasing olive trees to produce oil as the same as leasing land to farm, because the olives are still attached to the trees. Therefore, just like somebody who leases land as a sharecropper from a Kohen or a Levi has to give the Tirumah or the Maaser from the crop to the owner, just like the previous Mishnah said, so too someone who leases olive trees to make olives, or who sells someone else's olives to share in the profits, he has to give the Tirumah or the Maaser to the owner. Rabbi Yehuda says this obviously only in a case where the Israel leases the land from a Kohen or Levi owner. He would obviously agree in the opposite case where a Kohen or Levi sharecropper leases from Israel. The sharecropper has no right to all the tithes, like the Tana Kama said in Mishnah Gimel. And the Rab tells us, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Everybody should have a Erev Tov and also a Purim Sameach. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.